Okay, we're starting 1302 Unit 3. That's going to have several broad topics. There's going to be America in the 1920s. Then we'll look at the 1930s, which began with the Great Depression. So we'll see what what factors made that happen, how two different presidential administrations tried without success to make it go away, and then finally we'll fly over World War II at a very high altitude, as I like to say. Okay, the 1920s, the decade 1 century ago, very interesting, fascinating decade. I like to start with this. Let's imagine that the timeline is a multi story building, and each floor is a decade. And we just moved up to the 20s, the 2020s, and if we look around, we kind of see how things are. But then, if we could go back downstairs to the previous decade, which also didn't have a name, maybe or it didn't, I think the teens, I guess, that would look familiar because that's the decade where you grew up. But then you go back down to whatever the first decade was, the O zone, I suppose, and the technology would look different. There wouldn't be smartphones till about 2/3 of the way through. The computers would be slower. But you go back down floor by floor by floor, and gradually the world that you would be familiar with fades out. Okay? But each would be a little different. Now, what I'm telling you here is that the 1920s would be the last stop, if you could do a thing like that. That's the last decade where you would find an America that you would recognize at all. You could understand the people, what they're saying before that, but the culture would be different. Most of the technology that entertains us and so forth is just not there. But in the 1920s, um, motion picture industry is hitting the big time. Um, Commercial radio came along, the recording industry, all of that more or less native to the 1920s. So that's the decade we're going to start with here. And I start with something that's actually already going on when the year 1920 began. That's an event known as the Red Scare, or the Big Red Scare. And the deal is the color red is the symbolic color of the communist/socialist movement worldwide. What is now delicately called the People's Republic of China was for many years to us Red China, and I think that's probably nobody ought to be bothered by that. Red China. Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union, had Red Square, and the army was the Red Army, and you get the idea. For that reason, I've always thought, ever since they did the swapperoo here, that the colors symbolizing our political parties are reversed. I've never gotten used to it. It used to be Republican blue and Democrat red. But along the way, that got reversed. So I just always thought, red, why aren't the Democrats not red? Maybe they could explain that. They'd be less apologetic now than they were before. The Red Scare took place in 1919 and 1920, lasted a few months, maybe a little over a year. And what it was a wave of mass hysteria. This is mob psychology, mass hysteria, with people being extremely frightened that our government would be taken over by communists. We tended to refer to them by the name of the Russian Communist Party called the Bolsheviks. I'll put that on the screen. The Bolsheviks who took over. And it's not that in the Soviet Union's several decades history, everybody's a communist. Never was more than 2% of the population of that unfortunate state actually members of the Communist Party. So they believe they can take over from a position of a small minority. And in 1919, an incredibly stressful year, people were afraid. And this is not just long-term, well, we need to be watchful and concerned about that. That's not what it was. It was the fear that it could happen tomorrow. It could happen any time. And what would be wrong with that? Well, what would be wrong with that? And these are all hallmarks of communist takeovers. They really are. All your personal freedoms are canceled. You can expect severe persecution if you happen to hold serious religious beliefs. The government would confiscate all wealth-generating property. They would would aggressively and viciously suppress all political criticism. And of course, pack the court. If there were courts, they would make sure that no resistance could possibly succeed. There would be no opposition. So people were afraid of that. Now, I should tell you that the year 1919 was as troubling a year as we've had in our history when there wasn't a war going on. It would be, oddly enough, we'd feel at home with what was going on there for several reasons. Okay, so what all is breaking loose in the 1920s? Pardon me, in 1919. Okay, a lot of people were very nervous and jittery over a long period of time with the accelerating pace of cultural change. Values change, that sort of thing. The traditional American culture seemed to be just deteriorating, dissolving before people's eyes. And somehow that's vaguely associated with the war. And this couldn't just be happening by itself. Surely there must be dark and sinister forces behind the scenes making this happen. All the war does is accelerate the concern, both the deterioration and the concern. And during the war, the government is trying to stir up support for the war and dehumanize the Germans and all that. And as long as the war lasted, we could blame this decline on the Germans. Once the war is over, that doesn't last all that long because the Germans they're too white, they're too established, they've been here too long, they really don't make very good scapegoats on that. So the fear is just looking for new objects, and substance of the Red Scare is they're going to find them. Wartime propaganda is a factor, along with the dissatisfaction with the rapid pace of social change, and it stirs up fear, it stirs up hatred of Germans who are the scapegoats, and then we find other scapegoats later. There were some unsettling events of the time that made people nervous. President Wilson left the country, got on a ship in January 1919, sailed over to Paris, and except for one brief return visit along about March, he didn't come back till June. Now, no other American president had ever left the country while in office, except when Theodore Roosevelt toured the Panama Canal Zone dig, where they're building the canal, in 1906. He's gone about a week, and that was U.S. flag territory. So this is totally unprecedented, and there may have been a few people walking around already who thought that the government was necessary just to keep the world from flying off out into space. So, concerned about that. Then the president returned in June, bringing with him this proposed treaty that looked on the whole pretty good, but there were some things in there people started to notice and to object to, and the resistance to that grew and grew and grew until in September 1920, the president decided to make his cross-country railroad train tour that I told you about last time, and then he falls ill and just drops out of sight. They put him in the White House, and he suffered a physical collapse in Boulder, Colorado on the way home. And then in the White House a week or so later, he had a stroke, nasty stroke. He's bedridden, he's paralyzed on one side, he slobbers, he can't talk plain. I got over it more or less later on, and outrageously outlived his successor by about 6 months, but his successor was going to have some trouble too. So, and then this will sound familiar. We had a pandemic. It was an influenza pandemic, and I'm going to say the one we're having now is a minor pandemic. 100 years ago, you would find out what a major pandemic would look like, and you don't want to go there. It'll make ours look minor. It was referred to as the Spanish flu. Why? I don't know. To this day, they're not completely sure where it started. What they do know, it was extremely fast transmission and extremely deadly. Whereas today, if you're under 50 years old and in good health, your chance, if you catch COVID, your chance of dying statistically is like 0.05. And that's worst case. And even older people with comorbidities have a very high survival rate. Now, the so-called Spanish flu, that killed 1 out of every 5 people that caught it. Not 1 out of every 200, 1 out of every 5. All right? And the flu we have now is hitting the old folks the hardest. Children, if they get it, they don't know they've got it. But the old folks, like me, the Spanish flu hit younger people, younger and median adults the hardest. And so it ravaged Europe, America. It went global. It just faster than anybody can explain how it went global. It just laid low populations all over the world. There were countries where tens of millions of people died. All right? World War II killed, estimated around 22 million people in a little over 4 years. The flu in a year and a half may have killed 50 million people worldwide. Okay? So with that on the loose, people are going to be nervous. Now today there's all this government response to this. 100 years ago, zero. There's no record of President Wilson ever even mentioning that. It could be that people were not aware of how big it was, because in those days, without mass communications, there were things that we know about what was going on then that they probably could not have known. I don't remember seeing a mention in a history textbook before, probably 30 years ago or less, and I've been doing this for a while. Okay. See how I'm looking here. Now, the war is over and the economy slid into a deep but mercifully brief recession. All right, our economy had been just running on all 16 cylinders. Unemployment was negligible. If you didn't have a job, it's because you didn't want one. Farmers were getting higher prices for their crops than they'd ever dreamed they'd get. And with the military in drafting or enlisting 4.5 million men that came right out of the labor force, almost anybody could get a job. But it's running on war orders. Our government, foreign governments are purchasing vast amounts of stuff in our economy. Now, once the war ended, and it ended abruptly, just kind of rolled off the table, nobody even knew that there would be a need to transition the economy to peacetime. They didn't know there was a need. They're going to find out. So government contracts for this, that, or the other are canceled as fast as the paperwork can be drawn up. So factories are closing left and right. Farm prices are slumping. And then you demobilize and release from the Army about 4 million men who'd worn uniforms for a little while during the war. Most of them didn't even get to Europe, let alone into combat. And now you're unleashing them on a collapsing job market. What do you think is going to happen? So, with the economy collapsing, this that's not a happy time, along with everything else that's going on. And jobless veterans, these are some very, very frustrated people. Now, they served their country, they wore the uniform, they may have even seen action. Now they come home expecting to change out of the uniform and get their old job back and take up where they left off with their lives. Most of them probably did. But an uncomfortable number of them, they get back and their job's not there anymore. Well, we're closed now, or we're full up, or we're not hiring. And then to add something to it, you don't necessarily have to sympathize on one level to sympathize on another, but you look in there and someone you'd always assume would never even be remotely considered for a job at that factory is working, and you're not. So this is going to stir a lot of ethnic and perhaps racial problems.